Hello, you're watching Broadcasting Scotland. Thanks for joining us. I'm Hugh Stewart, and tonight I'm presenting Scotland at 7 on Tuesday the 2nd of August. I'm going to discuss the big stories today shortly with William Duguid, who's joining us from Perth, and our top stories, which we'll discuss in a couple of minutes, first of all concern Liz Truss, the potential Prime Minister, and her attitude to Scotland. So I'll be discussing that with William in a couple of minutes, but first of all, on day 160 of Russia's attack, I'm going to begin with a roundup of Ukraine's defence. First of all, the United Nations chief has warned that nuclear annihilation is just one miscalculation away. At the opening of a key nuclear non-proliferation treaty at the NPT conference in New York, Antonio Guterres warned that the world faced a nuclear danger not seen since the height of the Cold War. Humanity, he said, is just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. He said, citing this war in Ukraine as a significant factor. On Monday, yesterday, President Vladimir Putin of Russia said there would be no winners in a nuclear war and it should never be unleashed, in a letter sent to attendees of the NPT conference. However, in February, Putin pointedly referred to Russia's nuclear arsenal and warned outside powers that any attempt to interfere would lead you to such consequences that you have never encountered in your history. Days later, he ordered Russia's nuclear forces to be put on high alert. The US will send $550 million worth in a new tranche of weapons to Ukraine, including ammunition for the increasingly important rocket launchers and artillery guns. Ukraine received a batch of 4 more of the US-made high-mobility artillery rocket systems, the HIMARS, Ukraine's defence minister said on Monday. The US has accused Russia of using Ukraine's largest nuclear power plant as a nuclear shield. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that Washington was deeply concerned that Moscow was now using the plant as a military base and firing on Ukraine forces from around it, and called Russia's actions around this plant the height of irresponsibility. Daily gas production of Russia's Gazprom monopoly dropped in July to its lowest level since 2008, figures suggest, amid fears that Moscow could cause an energy crisis in Europe by shutting off supply. The state-owned energy firm pumped 774 million cubic metres a day last month, but that's 14% less than in June, according to analysis by Bloomberg from data released on Monday. Overall, total output for the year was 262.4 billion cubic metres, and that's a 12% fall compared to the same period last year. Food inflation has soared across much of the developing world since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and has trapped several richer countries in a cycle of rising prices, a report by the World Bank has found. France will donate a mobile DNA lab to Kyiv authorities in a bid to ensure that war crimes by Russian forces in Ukraine do not go unpunished, President Emmanuel Macron said on Monday. The Russian economy has been deeply damaged by sanctions and the exit of international businesses since the country invaded Ukraine, according to a new report by Yale University business experts and economists. So let's move on to the Liz Truss story from last night. William, good evening. Thanks for joining us. So I guess you might have noticed last night after we went, or about the same time as we were on the air, Liz Truss was addressing a Conservative audience in Devon. So did you happen to catch that? Because I'm going to start with our first story.
Well, I caught a very quick clip of it. I don't watch the debates because I'd rather out my eyeballs with a fork, but I did get to see that particular clip and the idea that of all people, well, Nicola Sturgeon, an attention seeker, who should be ignored, from Liz Truss, who is constantly making deep and meaningful poses on Instagram and seeking attention for her potential prime ministership over a long period.
Yes, I don't recall Nicola Sturgeon ever being photographed on a tank or wearing a Russian bonnet. And actually, Nicola Sturgeon has been banned from Russia, so she won't be wearing a furry hat in Red Square anytime soon. But let's look at the story itself. So, playing to her Conservative Party audience at the hustings, which was last night in Exeter, Devon, Liz Truss responded to a question on Scottish independence, but saying that she would ignore the First Minister's request for a Section 30 order And then, as we said, as we've heard, called Nicola Sturgeon an attention seeker. Liz Truss went on to describe herself as a child of the Union and said that she would apply UK government policies to the whole of the UK, with the implication that she would ignore the devolved parliaments and impose Westminster legislation in devolved areas. Her comments have been greeted with horror by the majority of people in Scotland. Commenting, SNP's Deputy Westminster leader Kirsten Oswald MP said, "The likely next Prime Minister has made crystal clear the partnership of equals that Scotland was promised in 2014 was a sham. Firing cheap shots to grab headlines is straight out of the Trump playbook, but reveals as never before the contempt Westminster has for the democratic choices people in Scotland make and the elected Scottish Government." Kirsten Oswald went on to say, "We've already seen in Brexit that the Tories and Labour want to ignore the Scottish Government's wishes and the wishes of the Scottish people and exert even more control from Westminster." Ms Oswald said that Truss's cack-handed comments are also a massive blunder on her part because they explore the ugly reality of Tory attitudes to Scotland and will only strengthen support for independence. So putting aside that kind of daft comment about attention seeking, as if politicians are all shrinking violets, what about the political effect? Is this a known goal for Liz Truss? Is this going to indeed lead to more support? Or would people sitting in the fence in Scottish independence be more annoyed by this kind of attitude, do you think?
Well, I think they will probably not like the idea of not so much Virgin, but the entire Scottish electorate, or that part that voted SNP, being disrespected like that. Whether it's a known goal in terms of her desire to be Prime Minister, I don't know, because she was definitely playing to the audience, and the audience it last night. In terms of the relationship between Scotland and England and the independence campaign, I think it would be nice if it were a gift to us. I hesitate to say that anything is a gift to us because it seems that so many things become normalized. But I suspect it can do no harm, and I would be very interested to see the faces the Scottish Tories as they go into the hustings in Perth on the 16th of August, because I don't think all of them are in any way comfortable with this. One comment today came from former MSP Mary Scanlon, for example, and she said Liz Truss has crossed a line and lost my support. And the reason she's saying is she knows what it will do if that sort of comment continues to be made, and the Scottish electorate hears it.
She has this reputation, Liz Truss, of being a loose cannon and of speaking without thinking. So in that sense, is she maybe a true inheritor of the Boris Johnson style?
Well, Boris Johnson was a loose cannon. He thought he could get himself out of trouble at any time. So he could say anything and then reverse out of it, and he was untouched by that. Does Liz Truss have the same ability? I don't know. I would tend to doubt it. I think she will have a honeymoon period if she becomes Prime Minister. But some statements have been, well, all the candidate statements have been outrageous to some extent, but hers have been particularly outrageous and without any great relationship to reality. And I don't know how long she's playing the game in the way Boris Johnson did. I know she has Boris Johnson's support, and I could see you can see a sort of kindred spirit there, but I don't think she has the same ability to get out of things.
Yes, he has his famous loquacity. So Liz Truss there was talking about, on the one hand, as we've reported, she was saying the best thing we can do is to ignore the elected representatives of Scotland. But she's also, of course, in that statement talking about strengthening Westminster control. That's how it's been interpreted by some people in Scotland, saying, and certainly by Kirsten Oswald. So it's actually more important than just her choice of language, isn't it? She seems to be saying the Westminster government is the one that matters, right? And she seems to be putting the Scottish government to one side. Do you see that as part of a strategy, or not just a rhetorical remark?
Well, it might be a rhetorical remark. You never know. But I think that well, we've heard this in places before, and we've seen as a result of Brexit the creeping control over bits of that relate to things that have related to Brexit. And so it could well be part of the strategy for the Tories, particularly if they're looking to make trade agreements, particularly if they're looking to put the NHS up for sale, which is a strong, strong possibility. And there are a lot of American businesses that would just leave if they got the chance. And they'll have to change the legislation to do that. They'll have to make the Scottish NHS as open to that as is the English NHS. That, if they try that and people recognise it, is going to be a severe problem for them. I think that would certainly cause ruptions.
Okay, now let's look at another story from England which may have effects on Scotland, William. The second story we have tonight is that schools in England are facing a looming funding crisis, with spending per pupil for the year 24-25 expected to be 3% lower than compared with 2010, according to new research. After a decade of austerity cuts, ministers pledged to restore funding per pupil to 2010 levels by the end of the current Parliament. But the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the IFS, says the government is no longer on track, that's the UK government, is no longer on track to meet its objectives because of cost pressures on schools. This IFS research calculates that the increased costs which schools are facing are just about affordable, as they put it, for the next academic year because of a £4 billion rise in the English schools budget for this year. It warns, however, that the government's spending plans going forward are insufficient and real terms cuts will follow, undermining the role that schools might play in its levelling up ambitions. School leaders, meanwhile, say that they're already struggling to balance their budgets in the face of massive hikes in food, energy and wage bills, with many warning of deficits and more cuts to educational provision. One finance manager said a secondary school in her trust has seen its electricity bill jump from £75,000 last year to £213,000. They're also worried about how to meet teacher salary increases with no additional funding from government and spending already cut to the bone. Schools and public services in Scotland also face increased costs. However, the UK government have refused to offer any increase to Scotland's block grant to help offset the increased costs faced by the public services. Meanwhile, new research has found that the Scottish Government's child payment is contributing to reducing child poverty in Scotland, with one of the parents describing it as a lifesaver. The interim evaluation by Ipsos Mori looked at the impact of the new benefit, which was introduced in Scotland by the SNP government in February of 2021, which was described as an absolute game changer in the fight to end poverty by anti-poverty charities. The evaluation states that the payment helps to reduce the financial pressure on households and generally makes a positive difference to people's lives. It goes on to underline that the Scottish Child Payment has contributed to reducing food poverty and highlights that the application process is quick and straightforward overall. The Scottish Child Payment is set to increase to £25 per week and to be rolled out to all children under age of 16 by the end of this current year. So there's two separate stories here. So first of all, funding crisis for English schools. Now, Conservative and Labour components are always keen to point, are they not, to what they see as problems with the Scottish education system, but it's not easy sailing down south, is it?
It's far from easy sailing. I mean, I don't like the constant comparisons between England and Scotland, whether they benefit Scotland or not. But certainly, the fundamental all public services share between Scotland and England is that ultimately it relies on what Westminster is prepared to allow. And that's the thing that we absolutely need to change. You mentioned, we'll come on to, no doubt, the child payment, but what the Scottish government does is the best it can with what it's got. It's fairly easy to criticise them on several scores. This fundamentally, and it's very worrying to hear about the kind of pressures that schools are under in England, because that will inevitably be the case in Scotland and will be reflected in the funding available for the next little while. Scottish schools will face exactly the same cost pressures as the ones that are being experienced in England. There's no doubt about that. So, yeah, it's a sair fecht at the minute, and something Westminster End needs to change in so many areas, and this is certainly one of them.
And so let's look at the child payment. Now, this is one of the measures that the devolved government in Scotland has been able to introduce, and this is not available to those red wall constituencies in England. So the report is quite early because the Scottish child payment was brought in at a fairly low level and not for all children. And of course, since this report, I think this Ipsos Mori report is about the beginning of the rollout of a child payment. And since then, the amount has been increased. So already at the beginning of the child payment, it was making a big difference. I seem to remember that a few years ago, a lot of the worst areas of child poverty were in Scotland, but now the things like the child payment are really making serious inroads and reducing child poverty in Scotland. Do you see this as the game changer that it was described as in our report?
Well, it's potentially a game changer, but there's a storm coming. The price is going to hit very, very hard. And all the Scottish Government can do, absent anything else coming from the Westminster Government, is mitigate. And so whether it will prove to continue to be enough to change the game as hits, I would tend to doubt.
Well, let's see how the Scottish child payment continues to impact on poverty as it's increased and rolled out to more children by the end of this year. Now, back to Liz Truss for our third story tonight, William. Now, we're talking about Liz Truss, of course, because of the two Conservative Party candidates for Prime Minister and Party Leader. Liz Truss still appears to be very well ahead in the Conservative voters, who are the only people, of course, who have a say. Now, Liz Truss has today been forced to U-turn on plans to cut civil service pay outside London after a furious outcry from Conservative MPs and the Conservative Mayor of the Tees Valley in the northeast of England. Rishi Sunak's campaign called the policy a dramatic U-turn, which reveals more than a change of heart, and said it could have a high cost to the party. If this was a general election, it would have been a potentially fatal own goal for the Conservatives. A spokesperson for Truss's leadership campaign said there had been a willful misrepresentation of our campaign, but without giving statistics, but confirmed that Liz Truss was abandoning plans for regional pay boards for civil servants or for public sector workers. The so-called Red Wall MPs, included Jacob Young and Richard Holden, raised alarm at the policy which was announced overnight, as well as the former Cabinet Minister Simon Hart, who said it would amount to cuts of nearly £3,000 for workers in Wales. The cuts would have affected the nurses, the police and teachers' pay, and would have reduced the devolved Nations Block grant payments as the result of a reduction in the ban that's consequential. So once again, this would have affected Scotland, although Liz Truss would only have control of those wages in England. But what does this indicate, you think, the idea that she said, first of all, we'll cut the pay outside London? Is this a reflection of the economic crisis and the fact that the Conservatives are in a problem, that they have to cut something and they don't know where to get the money from?
Well, they feel they have to cut something. It's their answer to everything, and it's always the cuts, and it's always the people with the big jobs who don't get the cuts. It seems to me that this is what happens when you try to pander to what you perceive as your party electorate's right-wing agenda. Its idea in the context of the cost of living crisis, taking money out of people's pockets is a ludicrous notion. It's also a mad idea in the context of levelling up, insofar as that's anything other than empty rhetoric to start with. You certainly don't want to introducing a London and South East weighting max and shrinking everybody else's pay. I suppose it's what's said during an election campaign, but an example of candidates saying the first thing that comes into their head that they think will play with the audience.
Yes, so as we've said, that the audience here is something like, I think I've heard about 160,000 paid-up Conservative members who have been receiving their ballot papers this week and who, according to opinion polls, appear to be supporting Liz Truss for Prime Minister by quite a large margin. So unless things change or unless there's any more dramatic missteps, it certainly looks like Scotland will have a new Prime Minister by September. as well as the First Minister. Anyway, I better move on. We can say more about that, but looking at the clock. So here we've talked about cuts and things down. Next story, William, here's something which is up, which is British Petroleum's profits. BP will hand billions of pounds to shareholders after tripling its profits to nearly £7 billion in the second quarter of this year amid high oil prices caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, sparking anger from members of parliament and campaigners as families struggle in the cost of living crisis. BP, which is a FTSE 100 oil company, on Tuesday today said its preferred measure of profit, which it describes as the underlying replacement cost profit, rose to about $6.9 billion. Now, I'm going to give the rest of these figures are in, that was $6.9 billion sterling, and the rest of these numbers are in dollars for comparison. So today's figures of the second quarter profits are $8.5 billion in dollars. That's from April to June, and that's up from $6.2 billion in the first 3 months of this year, and 3 times the BP's underlying profits for the second quarter of last year, which was $2.8 billion. So just go over that again. This year's second quarter profits at $8.5 billion, comparing to $2.8 billion for the same time last year. This is the second highest quarterly profit in BP's history, behind only its $8.8 billion in dollars of underlying profit in the summer of 2008. BP said it would hand investors $3.5 billion back through a share buyback programme, while it increased its total dividend payment by 10% to about $1.1 billion. Oil companies in the UK and beyond have enjoyed booming earnings in recent months on the back of rising energy prices, as households around the world have struggled with soaring bills. As Russia's invasion grinds on, the research firm Cornwall Insight predicts that the energy price cap on bills in Great Britain is going to rise to £3,615 a year, that's on average per household, from next January. Shell last week reported record quarterly profits of nearly £10 billion, that's in sterling rate, between April and June, while the British gas owner Centrica made operating profits of £1.3 billion in sterling, most of which came from its oil and gas drilling division. Shell and France's Total last week said they would also give shareholders billions of dollars in share buybacks and dividends. Okay, huge profits really made throughout the production and distribution of energy, and huge bills paid by you and me, of course, and indeed by Broadcasting Scotland. So there seems to be a huge public demand that something should be done about the distorted energy market. Has any of the candidates or any other political party UK-wide a serious way of dealing with this massive problem?
At the moment, it would seem not. Something does need to be done, and what needs to be done is for Ofgem to have teeth so that they can put a cap on that allows proper investment but doesn't rampant profiteering. That's what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing rampant profiteering and a cost of greed crisis. Big money for shareholders that they wouldn't have expected. And this lot isn't captured by the windfall tax that the government announced, because that doesn't kick in until 14th of July. So this is a prior period. I wonder what the profits will look like for the period the windfall tax is supposed to cover. We're jammed here, and something needs to be done. Something along the lines of what the French government did in terms of capping electricity and fuel prices needs to be done. I don't see the will for it anywhere in the UK government. And again, the Scottish government, which in an independent Scotland will be thinking in its own maps and much, much cheaper rules. There's nothing that the Scottish government can currently do other than, as we've said before, mitigate.
Yes, the Scottish Government doesn't have any power to intervene in the energy market. Many people have been commenting really since this situation arose, since energy bills doubled and it looks like they're going to be treble by next year. Many people have said, isn't it ironic that Scotland produces the energy and yet we have to pay more for it? It's a weird market, isn't it? Apparently that's something to do with the world price of gas. So even if you're using electricity that was wind or gas that was electricity that's wind generated and not from a gas power station, you still have to pay more for it because of the world gas price. So the market is distorted, isn't it? The market needs really to be sorted out.
It does. I mean, there are all sorts of things wrong with it. Not just the pricing being based on gas when there are other things that you could be using to create electricity more cheaply, but also the connection costs of Scottish producers to the grid, quite ridiculous, and based on old geographical distance from point of generation sort of considerations that don't exist anymore. So again, I don't see any impetus at all towards undistorting this market. And that's basically why we find ourselves in the mess we're in.
And we should just refer to Liz Truss again. She did say, I think it was not last night, but a couple of days ago, she did say that she was against any further windfall tax, because she said that tends to say that UK is against investment. Can you see anything in that argument? Are energy companies going to avoid Britain because they might have to pay more in tax?
Well, a windfall tax is by definition a one-off. I think a windfall is a windfall. Your investment plans are your investment plans on the basis of no windfall. Their windfall is partially based on high prices anyway, that I don't think are completely justified. Standing charges, for example, making sure that you're baking in a large increase. So, no, I'm afraid I have no sympathy for them at all.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and of course we pay VAT on gas prices as well, I think at 5%. So that, anyway, we'll move on to the next story. So that was massive increase in profits by the oil companies because of the higher prices globally. So we pay higher bills, and energy producers are enjoying record profits. So the next story is also on the subject of energy bills and economic problems that causes. In our next story, rising energy and fuel bills are driving growing numbers of UK companies into insolvency as firms struggle to cope with higher costs, supply and staff shortages, and withdrawal of COVID support packages from the UK government. Corporate insolvencies in England and Wales, the figures we have here today, jumped by more than 80% in the past quarter compared with a year earlier. That's an 80% increase in companies going bust compared to a year before, while the number of firms opting to be liquidated hit the highest level in at least 6 decades. In fact, they accounted for almost 9 out of 10 of the total of firms going out of business. Insolvency experts warned of a tough autumn where even more firms could go out of business, including larger companies, as a result of falling consumer confidence and demand. Excuse me, John Cullen, a business recovery partner at the accountancy firm Mingus, said, "This is an indication of the severe cash flow pressures that many businesses are facing, which are exacerbated by soaring energy and fuel costs. Inflation is testing the viability of businesses across industry sectors, and with interest rates expected to rise again this week, the cost of borrowing is also set to rise." There's been a reported rise in scammers targeting SMEs, claiming to be collecting unpaid energy and utility bills, adding another level of risk to small businesses trying to operate in a post-Brexit, post-pandemic economic crisis. It strikes me, William, that whoever inherits the Conservative leadership and thus becomes Prime Minister is walking into a massive economic crisis. If 9 out of 10 of the firms that have gone bust have just voluntarily gone into liquidation. In other words, they've just said, game over, we are out of business now. This is really, we're heading for a drastic economic crisis in Britain, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. It's a perfect storm, isn't it? The staff shortages are like a little brownish thread running that is currently facing business everywhere. They're partially Brexit related, I think, but also they're just part of the scene. I mean, this is also happening throughout Europe as well. Fuel bills, I mean, horrendous. There's no cap, as there is with households. And I know the Perth hub, where I'll be getting my next electricity bill quite soon, I'll be very interested to see how much we're going to be asked to pay on a monthly basis for a room and a kitchenette and a loo. And it's absolutely broke. Fortunately, we don't have any money because the cost of borrowing is going up. And of course, we're looking at the potential collapse in demand in the next few months as customers slash discretionary spending. So it's not a brilliant to have just started a business. And I think it would tax talented politicians to find a solution to this. So you can imagine just how much faith I've got in the two candidates for Prime Minister to do anything about this right now.
Yeah, the perfect storm. Yeah, so on the one hand, customers themselves, ordinary people, of course, are skint because of having to pay so much of their wages to the electricity and gas bills. And on the other hand, firms, particularly small firms themselves, are also having to pay those bills. And that's a good point, William, that although there is a sort of a cap, although it's being lifted, there is a cap on household bills, but there's no cap on the energy bill for small businesses. Like ourselves, of course, we are also having to pay huge electricity and gas bills compared to last year. So, as you say, whoever inherits is going to be tested. So we'll find out.
The wind.
Yep. And let's move on. Another really economic crisis story is our next report. British Airways will restrict sales for short-haul flights from Heathrow all summer, with no more tickets for departures before the 15th of August. In an attempt to head off further disruption and flight cancellations. The unprecedented move by BA comes in response to the London airport's cap on passengers, limiting total numbers to 100,000 a day after staff shortages led to long queues, flight delays and problems with baggage earlier this year. The airline, BA, says it's taking what they call responsible action, which would build resilience, and that suspending its sales of seats to domestic and European destinations would also allow existing customers to rebook flights as needed. BA cancelled more than 10,000 summer flights last month, but will not be removing any further departures from the schedule under the new plans, with no existing bookings to be affected. By removing short-haul tickets from sale, it's now impossible to book any flight from Scotland to Heathrow or beyond, as through ticking for long-haul flights originating in Scotland is not available until after the restrictions are lifted. So Heathrow, London's biggest airport and one of the biggest hubs in Europe, is in fact a Scottish airport, isn't it? In the sense that to get to many places from Scotland, you have to go through Heathrow. So this is actually going to have quite a serious knock-on effect on Scottish travel, isn't it?
Yes, it is. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's not just a Heathrow problem, but certainly the fundamental, our dependence on something in England is shooting us in the foot again. So yeah, if you want to be arranging a business meeting, you'd better be going down by train, and that had better not be on a strike day. Or maybe you fancy National Express.
Yeah, I know a good song about that. However, of course, the rails, of course, rail is incredibly expensive, and that's another problem, of course, isn't it? Because in Europe, rail is an alternative because it's cheap. In fact, the European Union is trying to encourage people to do small journeys, the sort of short-haul flights a BA are talking about. The European Union wants people to do them by train, but it's much more easy to do it in Europe, where first of all the trains are fast, and secondly they're much cheaper than they are here. Have you had an opportunity to use Interrail in Europe a lot recently?
No, but I do remember once buying a ticket from, where was it? Oh, jinx. It was a place not in Rome to Rome, and it was some like 120 miles. And I thought I'd been undercharged. It was basically €11. And I thought, it can't be that. I was so used to Brit prices, but it was. And I know that Germany particularly has got very good value period tickets to basically allow free travel. But we are just stuck in this hugely expensive morass. And I don't see a way out of it short term.
Yes, I think you're right. In Germany, I think they've got something like a €9 ticket for anywhere. So trains are an alternative. But so if you're not able to fly Glasgow to London for business, then it's not going to be very cheap to take the slow train alternative. So it's always been a mystery, isn't it, how trains are so underfunded in Britain. In fact, that's not getting any better, is it? Because the solution, the Conservative solution, seems to be to reduce the pay of the railway workers. Is that the Conservative answer that we've seen already tonight? Is that the Conservative answer to crisis? Let's cut the wages.
Well, yes. I think for business people, the answer is keep on Zoom and other things and improving them, and do it that way. Maybe that's the clean way to do it too. It's all part of the long and painful process of weaning ourselves, rather, off the old ways of air travel and other sorts of travel and finding new ways to interact with one another.
Yes, of course. I guess the elephant in the room, really, about gas and oil that we talked about earlier on, and aviation, of course, is a climate crisis. So I've not even talked about that, so maybe we shouldn't mention it. But we shouldn't give the impression to our viewers that we're encouraging more aviation, because that's another thing that's not been present in the Conservative leadership debates, the actual climate crisis, which is going to get worse. But we will return to that anyway. Let me move on to another story, which I hope doesn't get worse. We've heard today that Speaker Nancy Pelosi has landed in Taiwan for a controversial visit to the self-ruled island, offering what she called unwavering commitment to support that island's democracy as already heightened tensions with China escalate. The US House of Representatives Speaker's plane landed in Songjian Airport in Taipei at 10:45 local time, which was this afternoon, British time. She was greeted by Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu and by the US representative in Taiwan, Sandra Oudkirk, and is expected to meet the President Tsai Ing-wen on Wednesday morning, that's tomorrow. China, which regards Taiwan as its territory, has repeatedly warned of retaliation if Speaker Pelosi visits, saying its military will never sit idly by. Shortly before Pelosi's arrival, Chinese state media reported that Beijing's Su-35 fighter jets were flying across the Taiwan Strait. Ms. Pelosi tweeted shortly after her arrival that the visit honoured the US's unwavering commitment to supporting Taiwan's vibrant democracy. But even before Nancy Pelosi left the runway, China's foreign ministry was posting furiously online. China firmly opposes separatist moves towards Taiwan independence and interference by external forces, said the ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying. Earlier on Tuesday, Hua accused the US of reckless disregard and said it would be held liable and pay the price for hurting China's sovereignty and security interests. The visit appeared to have prompted high levels of military movement and preparations among the Chinese, Taiwanese, and the US militaries. So we've had some bad stories to report on tonight. I think this one gives me a really unpleasant feeling. Now, for a couple of days, the Chinese authorities had wind of a potential visit by Nancy Pelosi and were warning against it. Do you think this is a foolhardy move for Pelosi to go ahead with it anyway?
Well, I think there's rather too much saber rattling going on in the world generally. I do think that you can view it as provocative in a world that's currently overheating in so many ways. And perhaps the US stepping up its role as a slightly too assertive world policeman. And you can see in the same context the drone strike that took out the Al-Qaeda #2 on Saturday. The Americans are getting up to things, and the Chinese are playing games as well. And what they really need to be doing is speaking. All these big powers need to be speaking, because this is getting pretty unhealthy now. I know there's always a domestic context, and perhaps Joe Biden will move up his approval ratings as a result of being so assertive. But as I say, it's a very dangerous game in an overheating world.
Yeah, of course, China has always been extremely sensitive about referring to Taiwan as a state. So I guess that's why the Americans have a representative there, but not actually an ambassador. But of course, you're referring to Joe Biden looking ahead to the November elections in America. Now, that's quite crucial for America, isn't it? Because the Republicans are determined to win back Congress. So it's really about politics back home, do you think?
There's always some of that in it, always. And he's right to be worried.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Joe Biden has extremely low approval ratings at the moment. So that's the latest in Taiwan. Just before we move on, there is this, we're going to discuss self-determination in a couple of minutes. Well, what would you say if a Taiwanese asked you, do you support Taiwan's self-determination? Well, in a sense, China's right, isn't it? Taiwan is historically a part of China. So if we support Taiwanese self-determination, are we separatists? Are we splitters?
Personally, I support self-determination wherever the people want it. It's hard when you're up against something like China, and we know that from the way Hong Kong has been treated. It's hard for the Catalonians with Spain. I suspect it will be hard for us with the UK. But if a country's violence, people wish to determine how they govern themselves, and then Taiwan has taken considerable steps in that direction, that should be up to them, in my view.
Yep. However, it's yeah, I don't think they're going to ask Scotland's opinion, right? So I'm going to move on to a Scottish story now. Some new statistics announced today are about a fall in the number of suicides in Scotland. There were 753 probable suicides in Scotland in the year 2021, and that's a decrease of 52, which is 6% compared with 2020, according to new figures released by the National Records of Scotland, the NRS. Most of the decrease in the past year can be attributed to the fall in female suicides, which decreased by 42, which is 18%. The rate of suicide in males was 3.2 times higher than the rate for females. Suicide rates are highest between the ages of 25 and 64. Julie Ramsey, head of Vital Events Statistics, said the number of people dying from suicide fell to its lowest level since 2017. The decrease in the most recent year was mainly driven by a fall in the number of female suicides. After adjusting for age, the rate of suicide in the most deprived areas of Scotland was nearly 3 times as high as in the least deprived areas of Scotland. And that's a wider gap than deaths from all causes. So 750 is an extremely sad number, isn't it? It's good that it's fallen, but still, that basically it looks like from the figures that it's people from areas in Scotland where people are finding life difficult. So I suppose it's not surprising that those are the areas where suicide is at its worst. Is there anything governments can do about it? These are people who have reached a position in their life where they find, as somebody said this morning on radio, they find that life is not for them. What can politicians do to improve these numbers?
It's very, very difficult subject, suicide, and you can't be glib about it because there are complex reasons for it, and really no single cause. 6% drop is undoubtedly good news, but it's still more than 2 a day, and that's too many. It's also good news as a falling trend, but it really needs to fall so much more. What's undoubtedly true is that it's not just a very sad event in itself, but it's absolutely devastating for family members who are left behind, and there can be long-term issues for them. So, insofar as there's any identifiable pattern, yes, it's that men in more deprived areas still seem to be most at risk. So the answer is do something about the deprived areas. It gets back to the fundamentals of poverty, perhaps. Other than that, I think what the politicians can do is just beef up mental health services as far as possible. I know there have been some delays in getting people to see mental health practitioners. But at the end of the day, there will always be suicide, and that's why there are organisations such as the Samaritans, which do such a great job. I gather they get a call every 10 seconds. And they're volunteers, and it's a remarkable job they do, and they make it so much better than it otherwise would have been. The only other thing I would say, though, it's nice to see the fall, but it's also possible to look at the events of the last 2 years and also the sheer scale of the cost of living crisis to come and see a potential reservoir of mental health problems and other pressures on people. So we're by no means out of the woods yet. And the person that solves this, I take my hat off to them.
A tricky one, yeah. So there clearly is an economic connection from the figures, as it indicates areas of deprivation have the worst figures. What about the male and female thing, since we're both blokes, right? Do males have an issue in maybe not opening up? Maybe most of these cases, perhaps all of these cases, would not be suicide if somebody had gone to speak to a friend when they were at the lowest. Is there something that men really ought to look at in the way we look at our own feelings?
That's possible. Of course, there are men's organisations, men's sheds and other organisations that are seeking to change the way things are about being blokes. I would like to know a bit more about why it is that the female numbers have fallen, if there's any particular reason for that, or if there's something that's been done right there that could be translated across. But as I say, a very complex and difficult subject, and very difficult to know exactly what policy moves would really make much of a difference, other than just making the health service more robust, which is a problem on its own.
Yeah, of course, indeed. Yep. So that's the news anyway today, that the number of suicides in Scotland, although high, has at least gone down from last year. Now, we're going to move on to a completely different story now about the Expo, the big exhibition which happens regularly in Hanover, North Germany. Scotland's renewable energy sector and hydrogen sectors are to be showcased at the major international trade fair in Hanover. Scottish Development International has confirmed it will lead Scotland's presence at the 5-day Hanover Messe, the Hanover Fair Integrated Energy Expo, that's in April 2023. This follows the UK government's decision not to participate. The Expo is one of the largest events of its type in Europe, attracting around 1,800 exhibitors. The event provides a platform to reach global audiences, generating new opportunities and to build business relationships. The 2019 Expo resulted in £27 million of forecast export sales for Scottish exhibitors. Trade, Investment and Innovation Minister Ivan McKee said, "Ensuring a Scottish presence at the Hanover Messe enables us to build on our existing relationships with trade partners and to showcase Scotland's world-leading strengths in renewable energy at one of the largest expos of its type in Europe." So first of all, I don't know why the UK government isn't attending. That seems a bit odd. But this is principally about renewables and specifically about hydrogen. So I don't know if you've been paying any attention to that kind of technical side. It is quite possible, I believe, to run a lot of power, a lot of domestic energy by switching to hydrogen. And of course, the great thing about hydrogen is it produces no pollution at all. Potentially, depending on how it's made anyway. Are you a fan of renewables and exploring this type of technology?
Oh, definitely a fan of renewables. We spent the winter with Commonweal, Perth and Kinross going through the Common Home Plan, and Commonweal have been punting that again this summer, an updated version of it. Renewables is one of Scotland's strongest cards, and it's one also that resonates with voters. Or will resonate with voters, I think, in the coming Indie Ref. We've got considerable expertise and, of course, a huge amount of potential. So, yeah, great fan of renewables. I don't know why the UK government aren't bothering with this particular expo. Maybe they've got bigger and more expensive nuclear fish to fry. But hats off to this particular initiative, and I hope it works.
Yes, of course. The Scottish Government does want to move into hydrogen, but it seems to me there's not really a very big infrastructure for it. As I mentioned earlier on, well, somebody who installs central heating boilers just told me the other week there that modern boilers can run on hydrogen, but they don't actually have a hydrogen infrastructure. So that needs to be invested in, doesn't it? But again, I don't suppose the Scottish Government, do you know, could Scotland become a hydrogen economy without others moving in that direction too?
Well, hydrogen is one of a number of options for home heating and for other purposes as well. So it's part of a suite of things you would do. The truth of the matter is that in order for the Scottish Government to do anything in terms of building the infrastructure, you need independence. And you need, after independence, to have the political will to fund it through whatever means you can, be that borrowing, be that money creation, be that making the economy grow. Not a short-term thing, but the Common Home Plan, for example, will take what's left of its initial 25-year plan, or span rather, to put into place. So I would love it. I would really love it if the Scottish Government could take over after independence and really make something of this, because it is one of the things that we can do differently. And we're forming partnerships with other countries in doing so. We've got the partnership with the Germans that this Hanover Expo is part of. We've also got options with the Nordic countries. There is so much potential, and we're just not being able to realise it at the moment.
Yes, so just before I move on from that, actually, the other thing about the potential hydrogen economy is that the existing infrastructure can be used. So I'm old enough to remember the switch over to North Sea gas. Remember that? We used to use town gas made from coal, and then I remember everybody's cookers were converted to North Sea gas. So, and that was a massive operation, wasn't it? It took several years. That was government-led strategy, which was carefully planned and executed. So there's nothing for hydrogen, anything like that, is there? Do you remember the conversion? Took I can't remember how long it
Well, I
took,
don't
but
remember the conversion because we went to all electric when I was 3. So I missed out on all that.
that's what we need
Yeah.
anyway. We need to convert anyway away from well, I mentioned, of course, the climate crisis earlier on. So, and there's an urgent need to do that anyway. So we'll just move on now because that's something, by the way, William will try and cover in future, the whole question of energy and alternatives. We're going to look at hydrogen one of these days in more detail. So I'm going to finish tonight on a legal story. So the SNP, as opposed to the Scottish Government, has today published its application to intervene in the Lord Advocate's reference of the independence referendum bill to the UK Supreme Court. The SNP's application focuses on the right of all nations to self-determination, which is enshrined in the United Nations Charter, and argues that the Scotland Act should be interpreted in a way that upholds rather than denies that right. The SNP's business convener, Kirsten Oswald MP, whom we quoted earlier, said that the SNP's application is now with the Supreme Court. It's intended to support and complement the arguments for the bill being within the Scottish Parliament's competence, which is set out in the Lord Advocate's written case. The bill raises a fundamental issue of democracy in line with the principle of self-determination. Scotland's future must be decided by the people who live here and not dictated by Westminster politicians. And Kirsten Oswald finished by saying it's now for the Supreme Court to determine whether our application to intervene should be granted. So let's just focus on that one point anyway, leaving aside the Supreme Court's deliberations. What they're being asked for today is to also accept the SNP as, if you like, as one of the parties to this court case. Have you any comment on that before we move any further? I don't really think I know of a precedent of a political party submitting a legal document to the justices to decide on.
Yes. I don't know if there's a precedent, but of course, maybe they don't really talk that much about constitutional issues. So I think it's a perfectly valid thing to do. I don't think the Lord Advocate's submission said anything particularly strongly in favour of it. A lot of people have commented on that. The unionists have loved it, but some of our own folks have said that it's a little bit on the lukewarm side. I think that's inevitable because, the Lord Advocate is a lawyer and lawyers are very cautious. I think it's appropriate for parties in the general sense who are involved in an issue to make representations. And the SNP are able to say that they have a number of mandates, of which the most recent is certainly the 2021 Holyrood election, when 47.4% of the voters voted for them. And that is a rather larger percentage than some of the other mandates that have been used for referendums in the past, not least the Brexit referendum. So it's a point they need to make, and I think it's quite valid that they should be able to make it.
Okay, so the principle seems to be, I'm sorry, I haven't read the SNP's submission, I must do that. I'm halfway through reading the Lord Advocate's paper, and it's quite complicated, but the SNP seems to be saying to the Supreme Court, as you decide on the various factors, you ought to remember there is this thing called self-determination, which is international law. So do you think that's the sort of thing where, when they look at the Scotland Act and they look at the powers vis-a-vis Westminster and Holyrood, do you think the justices of the Supreme Court will actually say, it's already covered by international law, so is that going to sway them, do you think?
Well, I would love it if they did. I've learned not to expect too much from lawyers, to be honest, in my life, and I think this one has a long way to run. nobody knows. Some people think they know, but nobody knows how this overall submission will go, how this case will go. And it'll be a couple of months till we have any idea. And that's when it really starts to get interesting. But I very much hope that they say yes to holding an indie ref in 2023, because then we can get on with it and get a targeted campaign going, knowing exactly where we stand. I do hope they make some decision on it. I would hate that they would just say, well, we can't decide. It's just not for us to decide. That would be worse than hopeless. And if they say no, well, we just have to remember that at the end of the day, independence will not be a legal issue. It will be I hate to say the word political now, a political issue. And we need to get people on the streets saying, we want this, and in the polls saying, we want this. And fortunately, Westminster is pushing more and more people to be thinking about that. But that's how we'll eventually get it, I think, simply by the pressure of popular support.
Okay, well, yes, just finally before we move on from that. Now, by the way, the Supreme Court is going to start looking at the various submissions and making the legal judgments October, but that's this October, but it probably won't decide until the end of the year. There's a lot of very complicated legal arguments in those papers. I'll just finally, before we move on, the Lord Advocate seems to be stressing the idea that there's absolutely nothing to stop the Scottish Government consulting the Scottish people. That's one of the big arguments she's making. She's saying, this is Dorothy Bain, she's saying, well, first of all referenda in Britain are kind of advisory anyway. There was no legal compulsion on the Johnson government or the Theresa May's government to go ahead with Brexit, because she argues that the Brexit referendum had no legal force, and the Scottish referendum won't have any legal force. But she also says, however, it'd be stupid to say that the Brexit referendum had no political force. So I think she's drawing the same conclusion. If Brexit had to be done, then Scottish independence would have to be discussed as well. Does that sound a convincing argument to you? Yep. Yeah. Yep, I'm convinced.
Absolutely.
Okay. So anyway, that's the Supreme Court will be discussing the various submissions on the Scottish Government's right to hold a referendum starting in October. Okay, so I think that's it for tonight, William. So thank you very much. I know you've been on Scotland at 7 before, and first time I've met you, so thanks for being on the show to discuss tonight's topics. And I hope we'll see you again then. So it's been very interesting talking to you. So that's about it for tonight on Scotland at 7. So I'm just going to finish by reminding you, or pointing out if you haven't come across us before, that Broadcasting Scotland is only supported by our subscribers. Those are the people who have looked on the website down below. And if you want to support what we're doing, which is giving independent broadcasting for Scotland, then we need your help. Our only source of income is from the subscribers who have joined us on the website. So please have a look if you can manage anything. I know that we've just said before that prices are up and everyone's skint, but of course our bills to keep this studio going are also going up. And as we pointed out earlier on, we're one of the small businesses who are not price capped. So our bills are probably going up by even more than yours are. So give us a hand if you can. And also, if you'd like to help anyway, that you don't have to be in Glasgow where we're located, but in any part of Scotland or elsewhere, you could become one of the volunteers who put Broadcasting Scotland out. So it's you and excellent guests like William Duguid who joined me tonight who keep our shows going. So thanks for watching tonight, and I'll be back tomorrow for Wednesday's Scotland at 7. That's all for now. Good night.